Tonight, attention surrounding the Russia-Ukraine war is focused on a deeply sensitive and politically charged development: a ceasefire linked to Victory Day, and competing accusations from both Russia and Ukraine over alleged violations. The atmosphere tonight is tense, careful, uncertain, because ceasefires during wartime carry emotional significance far beyond military calculations alone. They create expectations, even brief moments of hope. And when accusations of violations emerge almost immediately, the emotional impact can be profound. Meanwhile, reports indicate that both Russia and Ukraine accused each other of breaching the Victory Day ceasefire arrangement. The claims and counterclaims have intensified scrutiny surrounding whether the temporary pause could hold under the enormous pressure of an ongoing war. And tonight, that uncertainty appears to define much of the international reaction. Because ceasefires are not only operational events, they are psychological events. There is something especially fragile about temporary pauses during conflict. People want to believe calm might last, even briefly, even partially. And when accusations begin emerging from both sides, the atmosphere changes immediately. Hope gives way to suspicion. Silence gives way to tension. That emotional shift now appears central to tonight's developments. Meanwhile, Victory Day itself carries major symbolic importance in Russia because of its historical and national significance. Any military or political developments linked to that date immediately attract heightened attention both inside Russia and internationally. And tonight, the ceasefire controversy appears to have amplified that attention dramatically. Because symbolism during wartime matters enormously, especially during moments intended to represent remembrance or unity. At the same time, Ukraine continues navigating an extraordinarily difficult wartime environment while maintaining pressure against Russian operations. Throughout the conflict, Ukrainian officials have repeatedly emphasized concerns surrounding Russian military actions and trust surrounding ceasefire arrangements. Tonight's accusations appear connected to those broader tensions, a conflict where distrust remains deeply embedded after years of war, and where even temporary pauses are viewed through a lens of caution. Sometimes silence feels more uncertain than noise. That emotional truth now seems woven through tonight's reaction. Meanwhile, Russia's accusations against Ukraine also reflect the broader information struggle surrounding the war. Competing narratives have become a defining feature of the conflict, with both sides attempting to shape international perception regarding military operations and responsibility. And tonight, the ceasefire accusations appear to have intensified that information battle once again, because every ceasefire carries political meaning, every alleged violation carries diplomatic consequences, and every public statement becomes part of the broader struggle over credibility and perception. You know, ceasefires during active war are often emotionally complicated even before they begin, because neither side fully relaxes, neither side fully trusts, and every movement becomes subject to suspicion. Tonight's developments appear to reflect exactly that fragile reality, a temporary pause overshadowed almost immediately by accusations and uncertainty. Meanwhile, international observers continue closely monitoring the situation because ceasefires can influence diplomatic momentum, humanitarian conditions, and broader geopolitical calculations. Even limited pauses in fighting attract significant global attention because they raise questions about whether larger negotiations could someday become possible. And tonight, those questions appear more uncertain than ever, especially as both Russia and Ukraine accuse one another of violating the arrangement. At the same time, the broader Russia-Ukraine conflict continues carrying enormous emotional weight across the world because the war has already reshaped security discussions, military planning, and geopolitical relationships on a historic scale. And tonight's ceasefire dispute appears to highlight how difficult even temporary de-escalation has become. Because prolonged conflict changes everything. It changes trust, it changes perception, it changes how every action is interpreted. Meanwhile, Ukraine's position throughout the conflict has consistently emphasized resistance against Russian military pressure while also navigating diplomatic and humanitarian realities surrounding the war. The ceasefire accusations emerging tonight appear connected to that larger environment of constant tension and competing narratives. And the emotional effect of those accusations is significant because people listen differently when ceasefires fail. They hear exhaustion, frustration, and the fear that peace remains distant. There are moments when even quiet feels heavy. That quiet, emotional feeling now appears to define much of tonight's atmosphere. Meanwhile, Victory Day symbolism itself adds another layer of sensitivity to the situation because commemorative events during wartime often carry enormous political and emotional meaning. Any disruption or controversy linked to those moments immediately attracts intense domestic and international attention. And tonight, reports of mutual accusations between Russia and Ukraine appear to have transformed what was intended as a pause into another source of escalation and distrust. At the same time, the conflict continues unfolding against a backdrop of immense fatigue, uncertainty, and strategic pressure affecting both nations. Ceasefires that might once have represented optimism now unfold inside an environment shaped by years of warfare and deepening suspicion. And tonight, that reality appears impossible to ignore because even temporary calm now feels unstable. Even symbolic pauses feel politically dangerous. Even silence feels uncertain. Meanwhile, as Russia and Ukraine continue exchanging accusations regarding the reported Victory Day ceasefire violations, tonight's developments appear to reveal not only the fragility of temporary wartime agreements, but also the enormous emotional and political strain carried by a conflict that continues reshaping lives, perceptions, and international attention every single day. Tonight, the fragile atmosphere surrounding the Victory Day ceasefire continues growing more tense as Russia and Ukraine maintain competing accusations over alleged violations. And the emotional significance of those accusations is becoming impossible to separate from the broader reality of the war itself, because ceasefires are supposed to interrupt violence, even briefly, even symbolically. But tonight, the accusations themselves appear to have become part of the conflict. Meanwhile, both Moscow and Kyiv continue presenting opposing claims regarding responsibility for reported breaches during the temporary pause. The competing narratives are intensifying international attention because moments intended to reduce tension now appear surrounded by renewed distrust and uncertainty. And that uncertainty is shaping nearly every aspect of tonight's global reaction. Because when both sides accuse each other simultaneously, clarity becomes difficult. Suspicion expands, and confidence in calm begins disappearing almost immediately. There is something emotionally exhausting about watching ceasefires collapse into accusations before stability can even settle in. People instinctively search for signs of relief during war. A pause, a silence, a moment without escalation. But tonight, reports surrounding alleged violations appear to have replaced relief with renewed tension almost instantly. Meanwhile, Victory Day remains deeply symbolic within Russia because it represents historical memory, sacrifice, and national identity connected to World War II commemorations. Any military developments linked to that occasion naturally carry heightened emotional and political importance. And tonight, the ceasefire controversy appears to have amplified that sensitivity significantly, because symbolism during wartime can intensify every action and every accusation, especially during moments tied to national remembrance. At the same time, Ukraine continues operating under immense wartime pressure while maintaining resistance against Russian military operations. Throughout the conflict, Ukrainian officials have repeatedly emphasized concerns regarding Russian military conduct and the reliability of temporary agreements during active combat conditions. Tonight's accusations appear connected directly to that broader atmosphere of caution and mistrust. An environment where every ceasefire is viewed not simply as a pause, but as a test. And tonight, both sides appear to believe that test has failed. Sometimes peace feels closest right before it slips away again. That emotional reality now seems deeply connected to tonight's reaction. Meanwhile, Russia's competing claims against Ukraine also highlight how central information warfare has become during this conflict. Public statements, accusations, and competing narratives increasingly shape global perception alongside military operations themselves. And tonight, The ceasefire dispute appears to demonstrate exactly how quickly political messaging becomes part of wartime escalation. Because every accusation carries strategic purpose, every denial carries symbolic weight, and every public statement becomes part of a broader struggle over credibility. Ceasefires during prolonged wars often reveal how deeply conflict changes human psychology. Nobody fully trusts calm anymore. Nobody fully believes silence will last. Every pause carries hidden tension underneath it. And tonight's developments appear to reflect that emotional reality with painful clarity. Because instead of reducing uncertainty, the ceasefire controversy appears to have deepened it. Meanwhile, international observers continue monitoring the situation closely because even limited pauses in fighting can influence diplomatic momentum and humanitarian conditions. Temporary ceasefires often create moments where governments and global institutions search for signs of possible de-escalation. But tonight, those hopes appear increasingly overshadowed by renewed accusations and political friction, especially because both Russia and Ukraine continue publicly blaming one another. At the same time, the broader Russia-Ukraine war continues affecting international security discussions far beyond the immediate battlefield itself. Every escalation, every negotiation effort, and every ceasefire attempt now carries geopolitical consequences reaching across multiple regions. And tonight's controversy surrounding the Victory Day pause appears to reinforce just how unstable the situation remains, because even symbolic restraint now appears difficult to sustain. Meanwhile, Ukraine's wartime posture continues emphasizing resilience, resistance, and skepticism toward Russian military intentions after years of conflict and repeated escalations. The accusations emerging tonight appear consistent with that larger environment of strategic distrust and ongoing pressure. And emotionally, that distrust shapes everything: how statements are heard, how pauses are interpreted, how silence itself feels. There are nights when uncertainty becomes louder than conflict. That quiet, emotional feeling now seems to define much of tonight's atmosphere. Meanwhile, Russia's position surrounding Victory Day also carries enormous domestic significance because commemorative events linked to wartime history often reinforce themes of unity, resilience, and national memory. Any controversy surrounding those moments naturally attracts exceptional attention inside Russia and internationally. And tonight, the ceasefire accusations appear to have transformed what might have been presented as a symbolic pause into another deeply contested chapter of the war. At the same time, prolonged warfare has created an environment where temporary agreements are increasingly vulnerable to immediate collapse under pressure from mistrust, operational tension, and competing political narratives. And tonight's developments appear to reflect exactly that harsh reality: a ceasefire announced amid war, a ceasefire questioned almost immediately, and a ceasefire now surrounded by mutual accusations instead of stability. Meanwhile, as Russia and Ukraine continue exchanging claims regarding alleged violations during the Victory Day pause, tonight's developments appear to underscore not only the fragility of wartime diplomacy, but also the emotional exhaustion surrounding a conflict where even moments intended for silence now struggle to escape the shadow of confrontation. Tonight, the controversy surrounding the Victory Day ceasefire has evolved into something larger than a temporary disagreement over military activity. It has become a reflection of how deeply distrust now shapes every aspect of the Russia-Ukraine war. Because when both sides accuse one another of violating a ceasefire almost immediately, the issue is no longer only about operational events. It becomes about credibility, expectation, and the growing difficulty of sustaining even brief moments of calm during prolonged conflict. Meanwhile, Russia and Ukraine continue maintaining competing narratives regarding responsibility for the alleged breaches connected to the temporary ceasefire arrangement. The dispute has intensified international focus on how fragile wartime pauses have become after years of escalating confrontation. And tonight, that fragility appears central to nearly every global reaction surrounding the situation, because ceasefires are emotionally powerful moments. People want them to succeed, even if only briefly, even if only symbolically. There is something profoundly difficult about watching hope and suspicion exist at the same time. That appears to be the atmosphere surrounding tonight's developments. A ceasefire linked to an important commemorative moment, but also a ceasefire unfolding inside a conflict shaped by enormous mistrust. And once accusations began emerging, the emotional tone shifted immediately. Meanwhile, Victory Day continues carrying exceptional symbolic importance in Russia because it is closely tied to national memory surrounding World War II and historical sacrifice. Military and political developments occurring around that date naturally receive heightened public and international attention. And tonight, the ceasefire controversy appears to have transformed that symbolic moment into another point of geopolitical tension, because symbolism during wartime can intensify every action, every statement, and every accusation, especially during moments connected to national identity. At the same time, Ukraine continues operating inside an environment defined by sustained military pressure and strategic uncertainty. Throughout the war, Ukrainian officials have repeatedly emphasized concerns regarding Russian actions and the reliability of temporary wartime agreements. Tonight's accusations appear closely connected to that broader atmosphere of caution and skepticism. An atmosphere where trust remains extremely limited and where even temporary pauses are interpreted through years of accumulated conflict. Sometimes peace feels fragile before it even begins. That emotional reality now seems woven through tonight's international reaction. Meanwhile, Russia's accusations against Ukraine also demonstrate how heavily information dynamics influence modern warfare. Public perception, strategic messaging, and competing claims increasingly shape the conflict alongside physical military operations. And tonight, the ceasefire dispute appears to reflect that reality clearly, because both sides understand the importance of narrative, both sides understand the importance of perception, and both sides appear determined to defend their own version of events. You know, one of the harshest realities of prolonged war is that trust becomes increasingly difficult to rebuild once it collapses repeatedly over time. Every agreement carries doubt. Every pause carries suspicion. Every announcement is examined through fear and political tension. And tonight's developments appear to reveal exactly how deeply those dynamics now affect the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Meanwhile, international observers continue watching the ceasefire controversy closely because temporary pauses in fighting can influence diplomatic efforts, humanitarian discussions, and broader geopolitical calculations. Even symbolic ceasefires sometimes create openings for larger conversations surrounding de-escalation. But tonight, those possibilities appear overshadowed by renewed confrontation and mutual accusations, especially because both Russia and Ukraine continue publicly disputing responsibility for the alleged violations. At the same time, the broader emotional exhaustion surrounding the war continues growing more visible as the conflict stretches through another prolonged phase of instability and tension. Ceasefires that might once have generated cautious optimism now unfold inside an environment shaped by fatigue, suspicion, and repeated escalation. And tonight, that emotional exhaustion appears impossible to ignore because even silence now feels unstable. Even pauses feel temporary before they begin. Even symbolic restraint appears vulnerable to immediate collapse. There are moments when quiet carries its own kind of fear. That quiet, emotional weight now seems to define much of tonight's atmosphere. Meanwhile, Ukraine's broader wartime posture continues emphasizing resilience and determination despite enormous military and political pressure. Throughout the conflict, Ukrainian leadership has consistently projected resistance while navigating the uncertainty surrounding negotiations, ceasefires, and international diplomacy. Tonight's accusations appear connected directly to that ongoing reality, a reality where every temporary agreement unfolds under intense scrutiny and enormous emotional pressure. Meanwhile, Russia's handling of Victory Day symbolism also remains highly significant because commemorative definitive events tied to wartime history hold major cultural and political meaning inside the country. Any controversy associated with those moments naturally becomes amplified both domestically and internationally. And tonight, the ceasefire dispute appears to have transformed a symbolic pause into another deeply contested chapter of the war itself. At the same time, the larger Russia-Ukraine conflict continues reshaping how the world understands modern warfare, diplomacy, and geopolitical confrontation. Every ceasefire attempt now carries not only operational significance, but emotional and symbolic consequences extending far beyond immediate battlefield realities. And tonight's developments appear to reinforce just how difficult meaningful calm has become. Because distrust now moves alongside every negotiation, every announcement, every pause. Meanwhile, as Russia and Ukraine continue exchanging accusations over alleged violations connected to the Victory Day ceasefire, tonight's developments appear to reveal a painful truth at the center of this conflict. Even moments intended to create silence now struggle to escape the overwhelming gravity of war itself.